I will begin this report with a statement that I have never made in 31 years of intelligence work, and which I do not make lightly. We were wrong. Not wrong in the way that intelligence services are sometimes wrong, by miscalculating intent or overestimating capability, or trusting a compromised source. We were wrong in a way that is both simpler and more damning than any of those familiar failures. We were wrong because we had already decided what the answer was before we looked at the question, and because we had already decided, we did not look very hard. This report is the product of 14 months of internal investigation. It is the most thorough self-examination this service has ever conducted. Every analyst who touched a human-related file in the last 20 years has been interviewed. Every budget document, every priority memo, every resource allocation decision has been reviewed. Every report filed under the Human Activity Monitoring Subdivision has been read in sequence from first to last. I will present the findings in the order in which I believe they must be understood. I will not spare this service, nor myself, the discomfort of the complete picture. Partial honesty in a document of this nature would be its own form of failure. The High Council has asked me to explain how we missed the departure. I will explain it. But I must warn the Council that the explanation is not the one that most institutions prefer to receive, because it does not locate the problem in a resource deficit or a procedural gap or a failure of any single individual. It locates the problem somewhere that is considerably harder to address. I ask the Council's patience as I work toward that conclusion. The path there is necessary. Before I address the failures of method and process, I want the Council to understand the full scope of what was missed. This is not a matter of failing to detect a single event or a single program. The departure was not an event. It was a process. It unfolded across 12 standard years, involved coordinated action across more than 400 human-inhabited systems, required the participation of thousands of individuals in positions of government, commerce, logistics, and military planning, and left traces, detectable traces, at every stage of its development. The humans did not hide their withdrawal. They conducted it quietly. But quiet is not the same as hidden. They moved through ordinary channels. They made decisions that looked, in isolation, like ordinary economic adjustments, ordinary diplomatic engagements, ordinary infrastructure investments. They did not, so far as our investigation could determine, take any significant action specifically designed to deceive our monitoring systems. They simply proceeded, at a measured pace, with a plan of extraordinary scope, while we watched other things. Let me be specific about what the 12-year sequence contained. In the first 3 years, the humans conducted what our analysts now recognize as a systematic audit of every point of economic dependency between human commercial entities and council-integrated markets. This audit was not secret. It was a subject of published policy papers in human academic journals, of internal government reviews that were logged in their own open archives, of speeches made in human legislative assemblies. None of this material was flagged. It was not flagged because no analyst was assigned to read human academic journals, human legislative records, or human government archives with any regularity. The analysts who might have been assigned to such reading had been reassigned to other subjects. In years 4 through 6, the humans began the construction of what we now understand to be an entirely parallel supply chain infrastructure, manufacturing capacity, resource extraction agreements, transport networks, that did not depend on any council member species for any critical component. This construction was not secret either. It was funded through publicly announced budget allocations, built by companies whose quarterly reports were filed with human regulatory bodies and available in their public records, and staffed by a workforce that, had anyone asked, would have described their work without evasion. Several of these projects were large enough to be visible, in certain cases literally visible, to standard passive monitoring systems. None of them were investigated. In years 7 and 8, the diplomatic component accelerated. Human representatives began visiting the homeworlds of 17 smaller species that the Council had, over the preceding century, variously absorbed, patronized, or marginalized. These visits were logged by our monitoring stations as routine diplomatic contacts. The notes from those monitoring stations described the visits as consistent with human patterns of minor multilateral engagement. The analysts who wrote those notes were not wrong. Exactly. The visits were consistent with human diplomatic patterns. What the analysts failed to consider was that human diplomatic patterns might themselves have changed. In years 9 and 10, the military dimension became visible to anyone watching. Human fleet construction accelerated by a factor our own analysts, reviewing the records now, estimate at 300% above baseline. New shipyard facilities were commissioned. Reserve forces were activated and drilled. The humans published, in their own defense journals, doctrinal papers about strategic self-sufficiency and independent operational capacity. I have read these papers. They are not subtle. They describe, in professional military language, a force being prepared to operate entirely without council logistical support. Our military intelligence division filed a summary noting increased human military activity, origin unclear, assessed as likely response to internal political pressures. That summary was marked routine. It was distributed to 14 analysts. None of them escalated it. In years 11 and 12, the withdrawal itself was prepared and executed. Diplomatic notifications were drafted. Legal arguments were assembled. Transition plans were formalized. And then, in the span of 8 standard months, the humans told the council they were leaving, demonstrated that they had already, in every practical sense, already left and withdrew. We learned of the departure when the humans told us, not one moment before. This is the shape of what we missed. I wanted to be present in the council's understanding as I describe how we missed it. Because the scale of the oversight is relevant to understanding the scale of the failure, I interviewed 47 analysts over the first 6 months of this investigation. I interviewed division chiefs, subdivision leads, senior analysts, junior analysts, and 3 analysts who had retired within the past decade and agreed to speak with me voluntarily. I also reviewed the personnel files and interview transcripts for 11 analysts who had left the service entirely and could not be located or declined to participate. I will not reproduce every interview in this report. The full transcript are available in the supplementary archive designated KIS/HC/0091, VEN/SUPA. What I will present here are the patterns. The first pattern I observed became apparent within the first week of interviews. When I asked analysts who had worked in adjacent divisions, those monitoring the Confederation of Outer Systems, the Myra Collective, the Tharkan Sovereignty, whether they had ever considered the possibility that human activity warranted closer examination, the answer was consistently some variation of the following. They had assumed another division was handling it. I will quote from 3 interviews directly, with names replaced by position designators in accordance with the internal review protocol. Senior Analyst, Outer Systems Division, 22 years of service. I always assumed the humans were being handled at a higher level. They were technically a council-adjacent species. I assumed there was a dedicated team. If there wasn't, I would have expected someone to tell me. Division Chief, Commercial Intelligence, 17 years of service. My understanding was that humans fell under the Political Liaison Directorate's remit. We tracked human commercial activity to the extent it intersected with council market systems. But for comprehensive coverage, I deferred to them. Senior Analyst, Political Liaison Directorate, 11 years of service. Commercial Intelligence tracked human markets. Military Intelligence tracked their fleet movements. We coordinated on specific requests. But for integrated assessment, the full picture, I believe that was supposed to come from the Director Synthesis Office. The Director Synthesis Office, when I interviewed its current chief, informed me that human assessment had not been a standing synthesis priority for at least 9 years. When I asked her to confirm who had made that decision, she was unable to find a record of a specific decision having been made. The deprioritization had simply occurred, incrementally, through a series of resource allocation choices, until it ceased to occur at all. What I found, in other words, was not a gap. A gap implies 2 defined edges with nothing between them. What I found was a fog. Every analyst believed humans were being monitored. Every analyst believed that monitoring was someone else's primary responsibility. The belief was universal and entirely without foundation. I want to note something here that I believe is important. None of the analysts I interviewed were being dishonest with me. None of them were covering for a mistake. They told me, with consistency and apparent sincerity, what they actually believed. The problem was not that they had made a decision to ignore humans. The problem was that they had never made a decision about humans at all. The monitoring had simply faded over years, like a signal degrading in the absence of amplification, and no one had noticed because no one had been assigned to monitor the monitoring. The second pattern was the budget history. I reviewed every resource allocation document touching on human activity monitoring from the past 25 years. I did not perform this review personally. The volume was too great. But I supervised a team of 4 analysts who worked through the archive systematically and flagged every relevant decision for my examination. The picture that emerged was consistent almost to the point of tedium. In 23 of the past 25 annual budget cycles, human monitoring was reduced. In 16 of those 23 years, the reduction was not accompanied by any documented risk assessment. Resources were needed elsewhere. Humans were low priority. The cut was made. In the remaining 7 years where reductions were accompanied by justification, the justifications were, without exception, self-referential. Human monitoring had been cut before and no significant intelligence had been missed. Therefore, human monitoring could safely be cut again. I am aware that this logic would strike any analyst, examining it fresh, as obviously circular. I am aware because it struck me the same way, examining it fresh. The problem is that it does not feel circular from the inside. From the inside, each individual cut was reasonable. The humans had not done anything notable. Resources were needed for subjects that had done notable things. The cut was a rational response to the available evidence. The available evidence was thin partly because previous cuts had made it thin. But that circularity is not visible when you are inside the cycle. It becomes visible only from the outside. After the fact, when the thing you were not watching turns out to have been worth watching after all. I want to be honest about something here. I approved several of these cuts myself. Between my appointment as deputy director 7 years ago and my elevation to director 3 years ago, I signed my name to 4 budget documents that reduce human monitoring allocations. I did not examine the reductions carefully. They arrived on my desk in the context of larger budget packages, flagged as low sensitivity, and I approved them with the same rationale that my predecessors had used. Humans were low priority, and the resources were needed for higher priority subjects. I am including this in the report because the alternative is to present a document that describes institutional failure, while quietly omitting my own contribution to it. That is not the kind of report I am prepared to write. I am in the 7th week of my investigation. One of my review team members came to my office and placed a folder on my desk. "Director," she said, "you need to look at this." The folder contained a summary she had assembled from the Human Activity Monitoring Archive. The archive itself was not large. The entire accumulated product of human monitoring over the past 20 years occupied less storage than a single week's output from our Myra collective desk. Within that archive, she had found a subfile that had been reclassified 4 times. The subfile belonged to an analyst I will designate throughout this report as Analyst 7, in accordance with the review protocol. Analyst 7 had been assigned to human monitoring as her primary responsibility, continuously for 11 years. She was, as far as my review team could determine, the only analyst in the service for whom this was true. She remains in her position. She was the last analyst I interviewed. Before I describe that interview, I want to describe what was in the subfile. Analyst 7 began filing what she designated priority assessments in the 3rd year of her posting. These were not routine monitoring reports. Routine monitoring reports in our system are filed on a standard template, distributed to a predetermined list, and archived automatically. Priority assessments are a separate category, requiring a supervisor's review and carrying an implicit expectation of follow-up action. They are used when an analyst believes they have identified something that warrants immediate attention from senior staff. In her 3rd year, Analyst 7 filed 6 priority assessments. The subject of each was a variation of the same observation. Human economic policy was undergoing a systematic reorientation away from council-integrated markets, and the pace and coordination of this reorientation suggested it was the product of deliberate planning rather than organic market response. Each of these 6 priority assessments was reviewed by her supervisor at the time, who reclassified them as routine monitoring notes. The supervisor's reclassification notes, which I read, offered consistent reasoning. The analyst's conclusions were assessed as exceeding the evidence, Human economic adjustments were normal and expected, and priority assessment classification was reserved for more significant threats. Analyst 7 filed 4 more priority assessments in her 4th year, shifting her focus to the diplomatic contacts she had begun tracking between human representatives and what she described as secondary-tier council-adjacent species in disputed or marginal territories. Her supervisor reviewed these assessments and reclassified them as routine. In her 5th year, a new supervisor was assigned to her section. Analyst 7 filed 8 priority assessments that year. She had, by this point, identified the preliminary outlines of the parallel supply chain construction. Her assessments describe, with notable precision, what she was seeing. Human origin capital being directed toward infrastructure projects in non-council systems, with specifications that did not match the commercial profile of the companies involved, and with no apparent connection to existing human trade routes. The new supervisor reclassified all 8 as routine. The reclassification notes from this supervisor are somewhat more detailed than those from the previous one. They describe Analyst 7's conclusions as analytically adventurous and suggest that she is perhaps too focused on human activity to maintain appropriate perspective on its significance relative to more pressing monitoring subjects. They also recommend, without any apparent irony, that she be considered for reassignment to a higher priority desk. Analyst 7 was not reassigned. In her 6th year, she filed 11 priority assessments. She had by now assembled what can only be described, reading her work in retrospect, as a comprehensive early portrait of the departure. She had identified the economic component, the diplomatic component, the infrastructure component. She had noted anomalies in human military procurement that would not be fully understood by anyone else in this service for another 4 years. She wrote, in the summary of her 11th assessment of that year, a sentence that I have read many times since I first encountered it. The pattern of activity I have documented is consistent with a species-level strategic decision to achieve comprehensive independence from council systems. I assess this decision is either underway or has already been made. I recommend immediate senior review. Her supervisor at that time was a senior analyst who has since retired. I interviewed him at his home. He is a careful, thoughtful person who spent 30 years in this service and who clearly retains a genuine commitment to the institution's mission. He remembered Analyst 7. He described her as talented, but, in his assessment, prone to overinterpretation. He told me that he had read her reports carefully and found the conclusions unsupported. He told me that he had not reclassified her assessments out of dismissiveness, but out of a genuine professional judgment that the evidence did not warrant the classification she had assigned. I asked him what evidence would have warranted it. He thought for a long time before answering. "I'm not sure," he said finally. "I think I was waiting for something more definitive, something that wasn't pattern inference." I asked him what that would have looked like. He said he wasn't certain. He said that pattern inference, from a low-priority subject, always looked like overreading. He said he had thought at the time that if the humans were really doing what Analyst 7 suggested, there would be clearer signals from other desks. He had been waiting for confirmation from other sources. No confirmation came. He had interpreted its absence as disconfirmation. This is a 3rd supervisor who reclassified Analyst 7's work, and his account introduces a mechanism I had not previously identified: the wait for external confirmation. He was not dismissing her work. He was, in his own understanding, applying appropriate skepticism. But the standard of evidence he was applying was calibrated for subjects where multiple monitoring streams existed, where an analyst's pattern inferences could be checked against independent reporting, where the absence of corroboration was meaningful because corroborating channels were actively producing. For humans, there were no other active monitoring streams of significance. The absence of corroboration was not a signal. It was a consequence of the same underinvestment that made Analyst 7's desk the only desk paying attention. He was waiting for a signal that the structural conditions of our monitoring made it impossible to receive. In years 7 and 8 of her posting, Analyst 7 continued to file priority assessments. By this point, she had been reclassified by 3 supervisors. A 4th supervisor had taken over her section. I interviewed this supervisor as well. She is currently a division chief, and I will note without further comment that she is considered one of the more capable senior leaders in the service. She told me that when she took over the section, She had reviewed the backlog of Analyst Seven's work and found it concerning, but not in a way the analyst seemed to intend. She had found it concerning because the volume and persistence of the priority assessment suggested to her a productivity imbalance. Analyst 7 was spending too much time on assessment documents and not enough on routine monitoring. She had spoken with Analyst 7 about this. She had recommended that Analyst 7 focus on building out the monitoring baseline rather than projecting conclusions. She had also reclassified the outstanding assessments. I asked this division chief whether she had read the assessments carefully before reclassifying them. She paused. I read them, she said. I read several of them in detail. I found the framing alarmist. The baseline for human activity was so thin that almost any change would look significant against it. I thought the analyst needed a more robust evidentiary foundation before the conclusions warranted priority classification. I asked her how the analyst was supposed to build a more robust evidentiary foundation with the monitoring resources allocated to her desk. The division chief looked at me for a moment. That's a fair question, she said. At the time, I don't think I asked it. I interviewed Analyst 7 on a Thursday afternoon, 8 months into my investigation. Her office is small and very organized. She has been at the same desk for 11 years. The walls have no decorations. The desk has a terminal, 2 data pads, a cup of tea that was cold by the time I sat down, and a stack of printed reports that she moved to make room for my recording equipment. She is not what I expected. I do not know precisely what I expected. Perhaps something weathered or bitter or performatively resigned. What I found was someone who seemed, above all things, tired, not angry, not triumphant in the vindication that the departure must have represented for her. Simply tired in the way that a person becomes tired when they have been doing a difficult thing for a long time with very little response. I told her who I was and that I was conducting an internal review. She told me she knew. I asked her if she would speak with me. She said yes, with a directness that suggested the question had been unnecessary. I asked her how she had first identified the pattern she had been reporting for 8 years. She described it without drama. In her first year on the human desk, she had been struck by the thinness of the existing file, not by anything the humans were doing. There wasn't enough data to identify anything specific, but by the fact that the file was so thin for a species of that size and complexity. She had requested additional monitoring resources. The request had been denied. She had made do with what she had. In her second year, she had begun building a systematic tracking framework, correlating open-source human materials, academic publications, legislative records, regulatory filings, commercial announcements, with the limited signal intelligence the desk was allocated. It's not a mystery, she told me. They publish things. They have a very open information culture by Galactic standards. If you read what they publish, they tell you quite a lot about what they're thinking. In her third year, the pattern had begun to emerge from the publications. She had seen the economic policy papers before she had seen any corresponding economic data. The humans had been writing, in their own journals, about the theory of strategic economic independence for at least 5 years before they began implementing it. The papers were quite clear, she told me. There was a school of thought in their policy community, a fairly significant one, that argued the council integration model was structurally disadvantageous to species at the human developmental stage. They made the case in public. They published the arguments. They had the debates. And then when the policies shifted, it was a shift that had been publicly theorized for years. I asked her if she had included references to these publications in her priority assessments. Yes, she said, in every one. I asked her whether she thought the supervisors reviewing her work had read the cited materials. She paused for a moment, and her expression did something complicated. I think, she said, that reading human academic journals is not something most analysts consider part of their job. The journals are lengthy. The humans write very long papers. The subjects seem obscure until they don't. She paused again. I think the citations probably made my reports look more speculative, not less. If the evidence I was citing was sources no one had heard of in publications no one read, the conclusions might have seemed less anchored, not more. I found this observation striking enough that I pursued it. I asked her to say more. The standard of evidence in this service, she said carefully, is calibrated for certain types of sources: signal intelligence, defector testimony, human assets. Those carry weight because we have established frameworks for evaluating them. Published analysis from subject area sources, what the humans call open source intelligence, is harder to evaluate because the evaluation requires subject matter expertise. If you don't have the expertise, you can't easily distinguish good analysis from bad analysis, and the safe default is to discount it. The humans had already told us, in their own words, what they were planning to do, but we didn't have a framework for taking that seriously. She said this without accusation. It was, I realized, the same careful analytic voice she had used throughout the interview, the voice of a person who had spent 11 years thinking precisely about a problem and had arrived at a clear understanding of its structure. I asked her how she had felt when the departure was announced. She was quiet for a moment. I had been expecting something like it for 4 years, she said. When it happened, my first feeling was that I had been right about the timeline. They moved faster in the final phase than I had projected. My second feeling was that I wanted to sit down and correct my projections retroactively to understand where I had miscalculated. I asked if there had been a third feeling. She looked at me, and something in her expression shifted very slightly. Yes, she said, but it wasn't useful for the analysis. I did not press her on this. I think I understood what she meant, and I think she understood that I understood. I asked her one final question. I asked her what she thought the service should have done differently. She did not answer immediately. She picked up her cold cup of tea, looked at it, and set it down again. I think, she said, that the question of what should have been done differently assumes the problem was one of procedure or resource. And I don't think it was entirely. She paused. The humans were low priority because everyone knew they were low priority. No one knew why they were low priority. There was no documented risk assessment, no formal reasoning, just a shared assumption. And shared assumptions are very hard to challenge because challenging them requires someone to say, I think we might all be wrong. And that is a very uncomfortable thing to say, especially when the assumption seems so obviously correct. She paused again. They were a young species. They were behind us in most measurable dimensions. They had not done anything that seemed threatening. Of course they were low priority. Everyone knew that. It felt like knowing the sky was the particular color it is. You don't question the sky. She stopped. I waited. The problem, she said finally, is that the sky can change. And if everyone is busy watching other things and no one is watching the sky, the change goes unnoticed. And when it's noticed, everyone is surprised because they all agreed the sky was a certain color, and they had all been agreeing for so long that they've forgotten it was an agreement and not a fact. I thanked her for her time. She nodded. She picked up her data pad as I left and was already reading something before I reached the door. Following my interview with Analyst Seven, I did something I had not originally planned to do. I requested the complete archive of her priority assessments, from first to last, 63 documents spanning 8 years, and I read them in order over 3 days in my office. I want to describe this experience because I believe it is relevant to conclusions I will eventually present. Reading the first assessment, I was aware of how limited it was. The evidentiary base was thin. The conclusions were logically derived but held with appropriate tentativeness. A reasonable analyst, reviewing it in isolation, might have found the jump from thin evidence to significant conclusion overstated. I understood, reading it, why the first supervisor had reclassified it. Reading the second and third assessments, I began to see more. The evidence base was being built document by document. Each assessment added a layer. The conclusions remained the same. The humans were reorienting toward independence, but the architecture supporting them was becoming more solid. I was no longer entirely sure why the supervisor had reclassified the third assessment. By the 10th assessment, I was certain the supervisor should not have reclassified it. The evidence Analyst 7 had assembled was not conclusive, but it was substantial, and it was pointing with remarkable consistency in a single direction. The pattern she was documenting was not the kind of pattern that appeared by coincidence. It was the kind of pattern that appeared because something was producing it. By the 20th assessment, I was reading the history of the departure as it was happening, in real time, through the eyes of the one analyst in this service who had been watching. She had been right about the economic reorientation. She had been right about the diplomatic groundwork. She had been right about the infrastructure construction, right about the military preparations, right about the timeline in its broad strokes. She had been wrong about some specific projections. She had underestimated the speed of the final phase, overestimated the degree to which the humans would seek formal council approval for certain aspects of the withdrawal. But she had been fundamentally, comprehensively, accurately right about the thing that mattered. By the 40th assessment, I had stopped reading analytically. I was simply reading. I was watching someone do her job with great skill and care, producing work of genuine quality, and watching it disappear into a classification system that rendered it invisible. I was watching her refine her analysis year after year, not because anyone was reading it and responding, but because she was, apparently, the kind of analyst who refined her analysis regardless of whether anyone was reading it. I was watching someone who was not angry and not defeated and not giving up, who was simply continuing to file reports into a void because filing reports into a void was a job. And she had decided to do the job. I read the 63rd assessment, filed 14 months before the departure, describing with quiet precision the likely timeline and method of the formal withdrawal, and I sat for a while in my office and did not do anything in particular. Then I wrote a note to my staff to arrange a follow-up interview with Analyst 7, because I had several additional questions. When I reviewed her personnel file in preparation for that interview, I found that in the 11 years she had been at the human desk, she had received 3 formal performance reviews. All 3 had been satisfactory. None had been exceptional. The most recent review, 18 months ago, had noted that she was diligent and thorough and had recommended no changes to her posting. The review had been signed by her current supervisor. The supervisor's name on the signature line was mine. I want to be precise about what this investigation has and has not found. It has not found evidence of deliberate sabotage. No analysts in this service suppress human monitoring intelligence for corrupt reasons or in service of any external interest. The failure was not malicious. It has not found evidence of a single catastrophic decision. There was no moment at which a senior official reviewed strong intelligence about the departure and chose to ignore it. There was no suppressed report from a well-resourced monitoring program. The failure was not a single event. It has found the following: a shared assumption, held without examination, that the humans were not worth watching, a budget history in which that assumption was repeatedly confirmed and deepened by its own resource consequences, an organizational structure in which every analyst believed another analyst was responsible for the subject, a classification system that, when applied by supervisors who did not share the analyst's subject matter context, consistently downgraded the product of the service's only sustained human monitoring, and one analyst who, against all institutional incentives, continued to produce accurate and important work that was not read, not distributed, not acted upon, and not rewarded. This is what we failed to do. We failed to watch something because we had decided it was not worth watching, and because we had decided that we gathered insufficient evidence to challenge a decision, and because we gathered insufficient evidence, the decision seemed continuously confirmed. This is an intelligence failure, but it is also something else, and I want to name it clearly even though naming it makes the remedy harder. I have been an intelligence professional for 31 years. In that time, I have seen this service recover from operational failures, from compromised networks, from analytical errors, from resource shortages. I have seen us adapt to new technologies, new adversaries, new threat environments. We are not an organization that lacks the capacity for improvement, but the improvement we have practiced throughout my career has been of a particular kind. It has been technical improvement. When we miss something because of a surveillance gap, we extended our surveillance. When we miss something because of an analytical error, we refined our analytical methods. When we miss something because a source was compromised, we tightened our source vetting procedures. Each improvement addressed a specific, identifiable mechanical failure. The failure I have documented in this report is not a mechanical failure. It is not a failure of surveillance coverage, though our coverage was inadequate. It is not a failure of analytical method, though our methods could be better. It is not a failure of source networks, though we had none worth mentioning for the subject. It is a failure of attention, and specifically, a failure to direct attention towards something that did not seem to demand it. I have spent 14 months looking for the mechanical fix. I have reviewed surveillance architecture proposals, expanded monitoring budget scenarios, enhanced analytical training programs, reformed classification systems. All of these are improvements worth making. None of them would have caught the departure. The departure would not have been caught by better surveillance if the analysts reviewing surveillance data were not configured to see significance in what they observed. The departure would not have been caught by better analytical methods if those methods were not applied to human activity. The departure would not have been caught by a reformed classification system if the reports being classified were not read by people with the context to understand them. The departure was caught by one analyst with inadequate resources, using open-source materials that required only literacy and attention to access, producing work of sufficient quality that described the event in advance with meaningful accuracy. She caught it. We did not listen. My recommendation to the High Council is therefore not a technical recommendation. It is a different kind of recommendation, and I want to be honest with the Council that I do not know exactly how to implement it, and that the difficulty of implementation is not a reason to avoid it. The recommendation is this: we must develop, as an organization, the capacity to hear things we do not expect to hear. Analyst Seven's work was available to us. It was filed in our own system. It was addressed to our own supervisors. It was written in our own language, using our own analytical framework. The problem was not that we could not access it. The problem was that it said something we had already decided was not going to be said, and so we did not receive it as information. We received it as noise. This is not a problem that can be solved by better surveillance or larger budgets, though those things are useful and I am recommending them as subsidiary measures in the supplementary document attached to this report. This is a problem that requires us to ask, as a regular institutional practice, what we might be wrong about, not in the defensive, liability management sense in which that question is sometimes asked. In the genuine sense, what are the things we have decided are unimportant? What evidence would change those decisions? Are we positioned to receive that evidence? We were not positioned to receive Analyst Seven's work. We received it as a bureaucratic nuisance, as a classification problem, as a symptom of an analyst who had perhaps spent too long at a thin desk and lost perspective. We were not wrong to subject her conclusions to scrutiny. We were wrong to substitute our prior assumptions for the scrutiny itself. I want to say something about Analyst 7 directly, because I think it is relevant to the recommendation. She is still at her desk. She is still producing work. She told me, when I spoke with her, that she is currently tracking 17 indicators in non-human species that she believes warrant closer monitoring. I asked her if she had filed priority assessments on these subjects. She told me she had filed 6. I asked who had reviewed them. She named a supervisor I know to be thorough and capable. I made a note to review those assessments personally. I want to be honest. I am not certain I would have recognized their significance before this investigation. I am not certain that having read Analyst 7's full archive, having sat with what she saw and what we missed, I would not still have read her current work and found it pattern inferential and insufficiently anchored. The habits of evaluation that failed us with the humans are not habits I can simply decide to no longer have. They are structural. They are embedded in how we are trained to assess significance, what we are trained to treat as evidence, which sources we are trained to weight. That is why the recommendation must be institutional rather than personal. I cannot fix my own epistemology by deciding to fix it. We cannot fix the service's epistemology by deciding to fix it. We can, however, build structures that introduce friction into the process by which our assumptions get confirmed, that require us, at regular intervals, to ask whether what we are not watching is more important than what we are watching, that create a real escalation pathway for the analysts who have been right for years and whom four supervisors have dismissed, that do not simply reward the detection of expected threats, but also reward the patient, unglamorous work of watching something that has not yet done anything worth watching. I do not know precisely what those structures should look like. I am asking the High Council to commission a working group to design them, with Analyst 7 as a mandatory participant, because she understands a failure from inside in a way that no review document can fully convey. I will close with a final observation. The humans, in the years since the departure, have said relatively little publicly about their reasoning. They have not been hostile. They have not explained themselves in terms designed to embarrass the Council or this service. They have simply left, and they are now doing what Analyst Seven predicted they would do, building, expanding, engaging with the smaller species whose trust they cultivated over a decade of quiet diplomatic work. I have read their public statements about the departure. In one of them, a human official who appears to have been involved in the planning, at a senior level, made a comment that I have thought about many times since reading it. Speaking about the decision to conduct the withdrawal planning quietly rather than publicly, she said that the goal had not been to deceive the Council, but to avoid a conversation that would have produced conflict before the humans were ready to sustain it. They had known, she said, that the Council would not take their preparations seriously until the preparations were complete. They had decided that was acceptable, that the Council's intention was, in a sense, a resource they had declined to refuse. I want to be clear that I do not know if this statement accurately reflects their reasoning. I do not know if it was said for strategic reasons. I do not know if it represents a genuine account of human planning, or a constructed narrative offered after fact. What I know is that when I read it, I felt something that took me some time to name. I felt that she had not said anything I could argue with. We were not deceived. We were simply not watching, and the fact that we were not watching was something they incorporated into their planning as a known condition, the way a navigator incorporates a known current. They did not generate the current. They understood it and sailed with it. The question this service must now answer is not how to punish the failure, or how to explain away, or how to replace the individuals associated with it. The question is how to become an organization that, confronted with Analyst Seven's next stack of reports, does not spend 8 years discovering they were correct only after the thing she was describing has already happened. I do not have a complete answer. I have the beginning of one. It starts with reading the reports. Respectfully and with full accountability submitted, Sorathven Intelligence Director, Krellin Intelligence Service 14 Cycle, Year 7 of the Consolidated Era. This document is classified at the highest available level. Unauthorized access or distribution is an offense against the High Council's authority. Distribution list. High Council members only 9 copies, sequentially numbered. Supplementary materials available through Secure Archive Reference KS/HC/0091, then/SUPA through SUPF. This story was brought to you by HSY Stories. Subscribe to our channel and be the first to experience every new story.